Tonight I'm going to talk about some research on the question of whether trade has a causal effect on growth, whether trade causes economic development. This is actually a very classical question in economics that has been around for a very long time. But it's only over the last 30 years or so when data became available that economists started to think about this question more carefully, to think about how to estimate the effect of trade on growth or on development more carefully. And in fact, the early work in the 1990s or so were, in some sense, not very conclusive about whether there's actually a causal effect. So let me just give you some examples. So Sebastian Edwards from the UCLA, he looked at the relationship between trade openness and productivity, TFP, and he came away with the conclusion that more open economies have experienced faster productivity growth throughout the decade. So between 1960s and 1990s. Now, if you think about this statement doesn't seem too implausible, especially when you consider countries like Singapore, South Korea, or Taiwan. These are the countries that have grown rapidly from 1960s to 1990s. And also, these are the countries that have a high export orientation. Now, there were also some skeptics when looking at this evidence. For example, Danny Roderick, at Harvard University, he said that most explanations of Korea's and Taiwan's economic growth since the early 1960s place heavy emphasis on export orientation. However, it is difficult to see how export orientation could have played a significant causal role in these countries. So he then went on to say that it wasn't exports that have caused the growth of Korea and Taiwan, but rather it was a combination of factors like good initial conditions, educated labor force, government interventions, and so on. And he also explained that the increase in exports in the 1960s was in fact driven by the increase in imports of physical capital that were needed for growth at that time. So in other words, the direction of causality actually ran from growth to exports, not necessarily exports to growth. Now, that's research in the 1990s, but once you move beyond the 1990s into 2000, I believe that the literature has uncovered some good evidence that trade has a causal effect on development. And in fact, I think that opinions have been shifting in that direction. More people are beginning to acknowledge that trade might have a part to play in development. For example, this guy over here, Bono, recently said that, or is willing to admit that only trade can eradicate extreme poverty. Now, Bono for a long time has been against free markets, against free trade, and so on. But now, even a fierce critique of international trade is willing, to admit that trade has a part to play in economic growth. Now, here's a picture that plots GDP per capita against trade per capita. You can see a very nice positive relationship over here of about 215 economies, and this is for the year 2013. And what you can see immediately from here is that countries that tend to trade more per capita typically are also wealthier, right? For example, Luxembourg is very wealthy. Countries over here are very open, but countries over here like Burundi are, not poor, but they also do not trade that much. Now, if you look at this positive relationship, you might think that, well, trade has a causal effect on income in this case. Now, actually, why is it the case that this positive relationship itself is not evidence that there is a causal effect of trade that runs, well, there's a causal effect of trade, or causal effect that runs on trade to income levels? And the reason is because if you look at this relationship, it shows that trade and economic development are positively correlated, but correlation does not imply causation. So in other words, when you look at the positive relationship, it could be that trade and income are driven by some common factors, right, in the same direction. It could be that income is actually driving trade. So the direction of causality could run from income to trade, but not necessarily from trade to income levels. So it is unclear whether that positive relationship implies that trade has a causal effect on income. Now, this issue is actually very important. So in other words, when you think about, so it's actually very important to try to estimate or to get credible estimates of the effect of trade on income. And the reason is because there are many poor countries in the world. For example, the LDCs, or the least developed countries, are one of the poorest in the world. There are many sub-Saharan African countries that are also very poor, grappling with poverty issues. Now, if you take the LDCs and the sub-Saharan African countries on average, you'll find that about 40% of the population still live below $2 a day. All right, so these countries are very poor. And in terms of child mortality, about 90 children out of 1,000 in these countries on average are not expected to live past the 5th birthday. So these countries are dealing with a high incidence of poverty and high incidence of child mortality. Now, these countries also at the same time have very, in some sense, low trade to GDP ratio. Now, trade to GDP ratio is what economists use to measure trade openness. So for LDCs and the SSAs on average, the trade to GDP ratio is about 0.8 compared to high-income countries like the OECD where it is about 1. So in other words, these LDCs and the SSAs do not trade as much, but also suffer from problems like poverty and high child mortality rates. So therefore, I want to ask a question. Can trade expansions improve economic development in the LDCs and SSAs? And I think that this question is fundamentally important. Now, estimating the effect of trade on development is actually not easy. It's quite difficult to do. And because there are several issues, and among them, you have the problem of omitted variables. So omitted variables are essentially determinants of economic development that are not captured on data. So you don't observe those determinants, so therefore those determinants could be omitted from the empirical analysis. Now, this is an issue because these are the sort of omitted, so these omitted variables could be the very variables that are driving the relationship between trade and income in the same direction, right? For example, you could have things like initial conditions, good institutions and culture could be driving trade and income in the same direction, but it's hard to capture initial conditions and institutions and culture perfectly on data. So you also have a problem of reverse causality, which makes it hard to estimate the effect of trade because it could be that income is actually affecting trade, but rather trade affecting income. Right? So these are the two issues that economists have to deal with in order to estimate the effect of trade on development. Now, just to give you a sense of what economists do in dealing with these issues, I have to take you through an econometric model. So instead of showing you an equation, I'll show you a graphical representation of what an econometric model looks like. In any case, an econometric model is a statistical model that economists use to estimate, causal relationship, correlations, and things like this. So here's a simple econometric model, and over here we have economic development as a dependent variable. So we call this a dependent variable because it depends on several factors. For example, it depends on trade. Economic development could depend on, say, FDI, initial conditions, education level, and things like that. So now our goal is to estimate the effect of trade on economic development, right? You can think about a measure of economic development as income level, so we want to estimate the effect of trade on income. Now, how do we do that? We would try to do that by varying trade, right? We try to move this variable independently of the other factors that could affect economic development. So in other words, we will try to vary this variable, the trade variable, such that these other factors do not move. They do not jiggle and so on. They remain where they are. And if we are able to do that, then what's going to happen is that the subsequent reaction of economic development can be attributed solely to trade, because when we vary trade, none of these factors move. Okay, so that's what we want to do in econometrics, in order to estimate the effect of trade on development. Now, in reality, it is difficult or it is implausible to assume that trade and the other factors are uncorrelated. So when we vary trade, it could be that the other factors are moving along as well. So these factors could be correlated with trade. What happened in that case? If we vary trade and the other factors happen to be correlated with trade, then these other factors will move. All right? In this case, the subsequent reaction of economic development will be due to trade, will also be due to the other factors. All right? In this case, the estimate of trade on economic development could be proxying or could be estimating capturing the effect of other factors, the effect that other factors might have on economic development as well. So how do we vary trade while holding these other factors fixed or making sure these other factors do not vary as well? So what we can do is we can try to force them and hold them where they are by using control variables. So control variables are determinants of economic development that we have on data. We observe these control variables. Because we observe these control variables on data, these determinants, we can hold them fixed. We can control for this information. However, the control variables does not characterize the entire set of factors that could affect economic development, because economic development could be affected by many other things. All right, so in this case, there could be some unobserved or some variables that are not captured on data. So think about institutions, hard to capture institutions on data. Think about initial conditions. What are these? You don't know. Very difficult to capture this information. So there could still be unobserved information that's contained in a model that could be driving trade and economic development at the same time. So this is only a partial way of dealing with the fact that there could be other factors that could be correlated with trade. Now, how do we deal with the unobserved variables? Now, because these variables are unobserved, there's no way we can control them. They are not available on data. So what economists do is that we will try to eliminate these unobserved variables from the model entirely. So if you have panel data or longitudinal data, you can do that. With panel data, you can use a tool called fixed effects. The fixed effects is a tool to eliminate, that can be used to eliminate a large class of unobserved variables, as long as those unobserved variables have a particular structure. For example, if the unobserved variables are time invariant, if the unobserved variables are permanent, they are persistent, the fixed effects can be used to eliminate the entire set of unobserved variables. So in other words, the fixed effects can be used to eliminate a large class of unobserved variables from the model. So now, the fixed effects can be used to deal with the problem of omitted variables. Remember, omitted variables could drive trade and income in the same direction. But the fixed effects cannot be used to deal with the problem of reverse causality. So we still have another issue, that that income can cause trade, or economic development can cause trade in return. So how do we solve this reverse causality issue? This is the difficult part. We need to exploit some external information, external from the model. So this external information will be summarized by a variable called the instrumental variable. So economists will try to use this variable, an instrumental variable, which contains this information that's external from the model. Now, if you look at this information over here, the instrument or the instrumental variable, this variable is not part of the model for economic development. So in other words, the instrumental variable is not a direct determinant of economic development. It does not directly affect economic development. However, the instrument could affect economic development through its impact on trade. So think about this instrument affecting trade, and this trade moves affecting development. So we will try to use this instrument to solve the problem of reverse causality. So this instrument has to be correlated with trade. The reason is because we will try to jiggle this instrument so that we can generate variations in trade. But we also need to make sure that when we are jiggling this instrument, we don't vary other information as well. So we got to make sure that this instrument is uncorrelated with whatever unobserved information that remains in the model for economic development. So that when we vary the instrument, we are only varying trade, but we are not varying the unobserved variables. All right? So finding an instrument is difficult. Now, of course, if we successfully find an instrument, then what happens is this. We can vary the instrument. The trade variable will vary along with the instrument. We can hold the control variable fixed because we observe these variables. Now, because the instrument is uncorrelated with the unobserved variables, these variables will not move. The subsequent reaction of economic development will be due to trade alone. All right? Now, getting an instrument is hard work. The first paper that was successful in doing so is a paper by Jeffrey Franco and David Roma of Harvard and Berkeley, respectively. They construct an instrument by using bilateral trade distance. They look at the country and they calculate the distance of that country from all other countries, and they summarize the bilateral trade distances to compute an instrument for trade. Now, this instrument has cross-sectional variation. So in other words, the instrument only varies from country to country. The instrument does not vary across time. And the reason is because geographic distance is fixed across time, right? The location is fixed. Now, James Farrer basically built upon the Franco and Roma instrument by generating time variation in the Franco and Roma instrument. And the way he did this is to exploit a natural experiment, which is a closing and opening of the Suez Canal in 1967 and 1975. So when the Suez Canal was closed, shipping distance increased. So in this case, when the Suez Canal was closed, the distance also varied across time. Now, in my paper, I construct an instrument for trade by exploiting the shipment costs of primary commodities that's reflected by the Baltic Dry Index. I'll talk about this in a little while. So let's talk about the Frankel and Roma paper first. Now, this is probably the most important paper in the literature on estimating the effect of trade on income. In fact, this paper has about 4,500 citations. Now, just to recall that we need to construct the instruments so that we can solve the problem of reverse causality. Now, the way Frankel and Roma constructed the instrument is to use the following idea that countries that are far away from all other countries will tend to trade less, and countries that are near all other countries, near the other countries will tend to trade more. For example, they say that the fact that New Zealand is far from most other countries reduces its trade. The fact that Belgium is close to many of the world's most populous countries increases its trade. So in other words, how much a country trade depends on geography, it depends on remoteness. So Frankel and Roma constructed an instrument for trade by constructing the bilateral trade distances of each country and then summarizing these trade distances. They used cross-sectional data in 1985. So remember that we need to use longitudinal data to solve the problem of omitted variables. So for them, they only have cross-sectional variation. So they used cross-sectional data in 1985, and they find that trade has a statistically significant effect on income, which can be interpreted as saying that trade does cause development. Now, this is an important paper, but however, it is not without problems. James Farrer of Dartmouth College, he said that the concern with the Frankel and Roma approach is that proximity may be acting through other channels other than trade. For example, proximity to the equator is associated with low income. So when you're close to the equator, you could be in a diseased environment. So therefore, incomes might be low. So in other words, what James Farrer is saying is that this geographic distance itself could be an initial condition for development. So where you're located could be favorable for growth, for example. So then the issue is that geographic distance could be correlated with initial conditions that affect economic development. In this case, we cannot vary geographic distance as an instrument without worrying that these other variables may vary as well. Okay, when we vary geographic distance, this other unobserved information could co-move at the same time. So that's a problem with the Frankel and Roma approach. Now, how do we deal with unobserved variables? We could use longitudinal data. We could use fixed effects to eliminate a large class of unobserved variables. Right? So remember that the fixed effects can remove all the unobserved variables as long as they have a certain structure. For example, if they are permanent, if they are time invariant, if they are persistent. Now, we cannot use longitudinal data to eliminate these unobserved variables so that these unobserved variables, whatever that remains, is uncorrelated with geographic distance. And the reason is because if we use longitudinal data, what happens is this. Geographic distance also have the similar structure as the variables that you're trying to eliminate. So when you use the fixed effects, you are killing off many of these variables here, but likewise, you're killing off geographic distance because geographic distance itself is time invariant. So how do we solve the problem that geographic distance is time invariant? So we can only use geographic distance as an instrument if geographic distance has time variation. That means it varies across time. If geographic distance varies across time and all these variables are fixed, we can use the fixed effects to kill off these time invariant variables while leaving geographic distance alone. So we need to introduce some time variation in geographic distance here. And James Farrer came up with a brilliant solution. He looked at the closing and opening of the Suez Canal. When the Suez Canal was closed, about 7% of world trade was affected. They had to be rerouted through South Africa. So the distance actually increased when the Suez Canal was closed, and the Suez Canal reopened as, 8 years, exactly 8 years after, and then after that, the trade distance went back, to before. Now, James Farrer technique generates variation in sea distances. So the sea distance now have variations across time. So he used this technique right, to generate variations in the Frankel and Roma instrument, and he finds that a 1% increase in trade increases income per capita by about 0.2%. All right, so this is probably the best estimates we have for the entire world. Now, what did I do? I consider geographic distance as a proxy of transportation costs. So that's my view. I think that countries that are far away from all other countries face high trade costs. Therefore, geographic distance is nothing more than a proxy of transportation costs. So since I'm interested in looking at the least developed countries, so I asked the question, is there a more direct measure of capturing transportation costs for the LDCs? Now, in order to answer this question, we have to understand what the LDCs do. The LDCs are mainly producers of primary products. They export a lot of primary products, so the export share of primary products over total exports is about 0.5. So 50% of the exports that come from the LDCs are mainly primary products, raw materials, and animal products, and things like that. Now, these primary products are usually transported by a kind of vessel, or ocean freight by a kind of vessel known as the dry bulk carriers. There are four subclasses of dry bulk carriers. From smallest to largest, we have the Handysize, we have the Supramax, we have the Panamax. So Panamax are the biggest dry ships that can pass through the Panama Canal, so about 30 meters wide. And then we have the Capesize, which is too big to pass through either the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal. All right? So most of these Capesize will have to pass through South Africa or South America. Now, the cost of utilizing dry ships or bulk shipping is summarized by the Baltic Dry Index. So this is the trade cost that I'll use or that I'll exploit to study the effect of trade on income for the LDCs. So here's a picture of a bulk carrier. So this is the largest bulk carrier in the world. So this bulk carrier is called MS All Brazil. It's a Capesize, so it's too big to pass through the Panama Canal or Suez Canal. So it's about 362 meters long and 65 meters wide. So one characteristic about bulk carrier is that there are many openings on top. So these openings are called a hatchway that facilitates the loading and unloading of primary commodities. Now, here is a chart that shows you the Baltic Dry Index. So this is not the daily Baltic Dry Index, but rather this is the yearly average of the Baltic Dry Index. I'll just rip this off from my paper. Now, what you can see here is that the Baltic Dry Index is highly volatile, especially during this time. All right. In fact, it went up to something like 11,000 points, and it's down to like 1,000 points, somewhere around here. And just recently, this year, the Baltic Dry Index is at the 30-year low. So I'm just trying to think about how to buy stocks, that's related to the Baltic, but it's too risky to do that. So what do? I combine the Baltic Dry Index with the share of primary trade over total trade to construct an instrument for trade for the LDCs. So in fact, what I do is that I just multiply these two information together. So the idea is this: countries that utilize more or that do more primary trade have to utilize, on average, dry bulk carriers or bulk carriers. As a result of which, the cost of bulk shipping will matter more for countries that do more primary trade. All right. So what I found is that a 1% increase in trade increases income per capita for the LDCs by 0.5%. By 0.5%. Now, this estimate is larger than an estimate by FARA. So recall that the FARA's estimate is for the whole world, right? So it includes developing countries, developed countries, and so on. My estimate is only for the LDC. So what this is saying is that countries that are poor will stand to gain more from trade, right? So when they trade more, the impact on income is higher for countries that are poor. All right, so what's next? Is trade always beneficial for economic development? So income is only one indicator of economic development. There could be other measures of economic development. For example, health, right, is one indicator of economic development. There could be poverty. My PhD student is working on urbanization. That could also be an indicator of economic development. So my ex-students and my current student, we did some further work to look at to study the effect of trade on health, looking at health as an indicator of economic development. So in this paper, we look at the impact of trade on child mortality in the LDCs. And in the second paper, we look at the impact of trade on HIV incidence rate in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, concerning the relationship between trade and child mortality in the LDCs, we find that trade may increase the infant and child mortality rate. So I say here weakly, it's not that the evidence is weak. In fact, the results are highly statistically significant, but the size is not very big. All right. So I did some back of the envelope calculations, and I found that for small countries like Equatorial Guinea, a 1% increase in trade per capita could increase could lead to 20 additional deaths of children under the age of 5. So for larger countries such as Tanzania and Uganda, the additional number of deaths could be as high as 700 for 1% increase in trade. So that's just a very rough sort of back of the envelope calculations. Now, of course, we are looking only at the 1% increase in trade, but if you think about 5% increase in trade per capita, then child mortality, the numbers will be a lot higher. Now, of course, then the question is, why is trade potentially harmful to health or potentially harmful to children? So our hypothesis is that trade could affect pollution, and pollution could harm health. So there's actually some evidence that increased pollution could lead to higher infant mortality, and in the literature, the estimated elasticity of infant mortality rate with respect to sulfur dioxide is about 0.1. So in other words, if sulfur dioxide increased by 1%, then the infant mortality rate will increase by 0.1%. All right? So we look at whether trade could increase pollution, and we found some evidence that that is true in the LDCs for some countries. And we found that a 1% increase in trade per capita increases sulfur dioxide emissions per capita by 0.8% on average. So then we also studied whether this pollution could affect child mortality and infant mortality, and we found some good evidence that it does. So in fact, we found that the 1% increase in sulfur dioxide increases the under 5 child mortality rate by 0.1% on average. So these numbers are quite similar to what the literature has reported for the other countries. So in another paper, I've also looked at the impact of trade on HIV. The first paper to look at this issue is Emily Oster at Brown University. She, according to her calculations, she showed that the doubling of exports can lead to a 10 to 70% increase in HIV infections on average. And in my paper, with an ex-PhD student, we found that doubling of exports per capita could increase HIV incidence by about 55% on average. So our estimates sit somewhere in between the estimates of Emily Oster. Now, why is it that exports could increase, increase the spread of HIV? One hypothesis is that when exports increase, there's more movement of people, there's more interaction, for example. When exports increase, when trade increase, there could be more trucking activities. Now, the HIV is more prevalent among truck drivers than among the general population. So I came across an estimate for South Africa. The prevalence rate is something like 18% in South Africa, but among truck drivers in South Africa, the prevalence rate is about 25%. So when there's an increase in exports, truck drivers start driving, they move around, and well, potentially, I'm not saying they spread HIV, but that's one of the mechanisms that was suggested by Emily Oster. So now I just want to say something about myself, me. So I've done work on several topics. So this is not the only thing that I'm working on. I've written a paper on the effect of oil price shocks on the US stock market. I've also written a paper about China, and also did an estimation of the returns to having a university education in Singapore. All right, so these are the several things that I've done. So the question is, why am I researching on BDI, trade and income? So actually, before I actually got into this research, when I was a grad student, a poor grad student, I was trying to look for stocks to invest in, to buy. So the stocks that I want to buy are stocks that provide a very high yield, like 10% or so. And the stocks that jump out immediately are the shipping stocks like containers or dry bulk shippings and all these things. So I bought into several shipping stocks in the US market that do not exist today. So it's good that I got burned also. Now, the interesting thing about, when I was investing in these companies, I also noticed that there is nothing in the literature, in trade literature, about the Baltic Dry Index. But there's a lot of work that's done on forecasting the BDI. because a BDI is a good indicator of global economic activity, right? But there's very little that's done in the international trade literature on the Baltic Dry Index. So I thought perhaps maybe I could take one of the classical questions in international trade and see how this fits into that, so that I can keep track of the Baltic Dry Index while working on my research, which is great. So since then, I have some students who have joined me in this endeavor. So I want to take this opportunity to talk about the research that my students have done. So Ngọc Pham, we call her An. She's a senior PhD student. She's going to graduate in about, not graduate, but she's going to submit a thesis in about 3 months' time. She has done a lot of work on this area. In fact, she has improved upon the estimation techniques, and she has done a lot more than what I've done. So she looked at the relationship between trade costs and economic development for landlocked developing countries. Now, landlocked developing countries are extremely poor. Least LDCs are very poor. Landlocked LDCs are even poorer. So she's interested in implications of trade costs on economic development for these countries. And she also looks at the relationship between exports and urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa is a very interesting topic, very hot topic right now. And the reason is because in sub-Saharan Africa, you could have highly urbanized areas, but without economic growth. So many countries have big cities, but they haven't gone through the stages of economic development. So they could have urbanization without structural transformation. And I also have a student, second-year student, Pide, who's working with An. He's looking at the relationship between HIV incidence and some fractionalization of society. So I will talk about research 1 and 3 very briefly because of time constraints. Now, this is a picture that An had used for her 3-minute thesis talk in a university here. She represented the Faculty of Professions in the 3-minute thesis competition. So this is a satellite nighttime image of Lesotho, which is a landlocked country in South Africa. Now, she's interested in looking at landlocked developing countries because landlocked developing countries on average are poorer. So if you look at the GDP per capita of all the landlocked LDCs, so all the LDCs that are landlocked, you look at the GDP per capita, is something like $600 US. But if you look at the GDP per capita of coastal LDCs, it's about 1,200. So landlocked developing countries have about 1/2 of the GDP of coastal LDCs. Now, these landlocked developing countries faces extremely high trade costs. For example, on average, the landlocked developing countries face about twice the trade costs as compared with the transit neighbors. So the landlocked developing countries also are less open than the coastal LDCs for obvious reasons because they are landlocked. So for example, the trade openness of landlocked LDCs is about 70%. So trade over GDP is about 0.7. If you compare that to LDCs, it's about 0.8. All right, so landlocked LDCs tend to trade even less. They are poorer than the LDCs, the coastal LDCs, and trade less than the coastal LDCs. Now, the landlocked developing countries, or LDCs, also have very high containerized trade share because why? They need to transport their products through containers like Lesotho. In fact, Lesotho is one of the success stories in sub-Saharan Africa. They are the largest producers of garments in the continent. So many landlocked developing countries have to utilize containers or containerized trade, which is very expensive. In fact, about 2/3 of the landlocked developing countries have containerized trade share of more than 50%. And for the case of Lesotho, it's about 90%. So 90% of Lesotho's trade are basically transported by containers. So what my student was interested to know is that what happens if you significantly reduce, think about the experiment where you significantly reduce the cost of containerized trade or containerized shipping. And she found some striking evidence. So for landlocked LDC, she found that a 50% reduction in container shipping costs increases income per capita by 30% on average. So this effect is huge. So she also found that a 1% increase in trade per capita on average increases income per capita by nearly 1%. All right, so if you recall the paper that I wrote earlier, we found that for all LDCs, a 1% increase in trade per capita increases income per capita by about 0.5%. In this case, the contribution of trade to income is even higher for the landlocked LDCs. So in other words, these countries are even poorer than the coastal LDCs, but if you can help them to access trade or to trade even more, then these countries will benefit even more. And also, a 1% increase in trade per capita has significant impact on reducing infant and child mortality rates. So in another paper or project, Pide and An looked at, so they were looking at the cross-sectional variations HIV prevalence in sub-Saharan Africa. So they are interested to know why are some countries, why do some areas have higher prevalence rate than other areas? And in particular, they are interested to know whether the fragmentation of societies could potentially weaken the spread of HIV. So this is what they do. So they think about, so the first thing to, they do is to think about finding a stimulus for, to generate the increase in HIV. Because this is, we can't really run an experiment, so we need to find a stimulus that can increase HIV across sub-Saharan Africa. And recall the paper by Emily Oster. Emily Oster found that the doubling of exports increased the incidence by 10 to 70%. So for them, so they think about using exports, increasing exports to generate an increase in HIV incidence. So that is the experiment that they are carrying out. So after doing so, they want to compare between some countries from others, whether some countries, whether in some countries the increase in HIV incidence is higher than some other countries. So in particular, they're interested in looking at whether fragmentation of societies can slow down the spread of HIV. So to measure fragmentation of societies, they look at genetic diversity, whether societies are homogeneous, whether they're heterogeneous, and so on. They also look at fragmentation of societies along religious, ethnicity, linguistic, along those lines. So what they found is this: countries that are more genetically diverse or they're more fractionalized tend to be able to slow down the propagation of HIV. So remember that the HIV is stimulated by the increase in export. So that's the experiment that they have done, and they found that for countries that are more fractionalized in terms of in terms of genetics, in terms of religion, these countries tend to be able to slow down the increase in HIV. Now, of course, the question is why. One possibility is that increased genetic diversity and social fractionalization is associated with lower levels of trust in societies. So you think about HIV, right? Somebody who has HIV, you can't really verify whether this person has HIV or not. But in societies that are more trusting, that trust itself could help to propagate the spread of HIV. All right? So societies that are less trusting probably on average are unlikely to engage in risky activities. So that's the idea. As to why increase in genetic diversity, you are less alike than me. There's more heterogeneity in the race and heterogeneity in religion. So this can help to lower trust levels in societies and therefore slow down the propagation of HIV. So now in conclusion, what I found is that there is evidence that trade can lead to high income levels on average in the LDCs and also in the SSAs. I should say that for countries that are less open to trade, the countries that are poorer, the contribution to trade on development is even larger. So you think about landlocked countries, these are the poorest countries. But the impact of trade on income is even larger for landlocked least developed countries than for coastal least developed countries. Now the question of whether trade can lead to poverty reduction is less certain. I would say it's less certain because in this, so when we do econometric model, we can only say that, we can only make comment about how trade can affect income levels on average. So it's only the average that's moving. We do not know whether the poor people are actually getting better. It could be that the wealthier are getting better. So if you think about, say, income distribution, we can't really say, right, that the poor people in poor countries are becoming more well off when there's more trade. And in fact, I think that trade could have adverse consequences, like, for example, in the LDCs that we're looking at. Trade could increase pollution, like carbon dioxide, could increase SO2. Trade could lead to poorer health outcomes, for example, higher mortality rates. Trade could also lead to higher HIV incidence rates, right? Because when there's an increase in exports, increase in trucking activities, that's one potential mechanism as to how trade can lead to the spread of HIV. So going back to the question of whether international trade can lead to greater economic development, actually it really depends on what dimensions of economic development you're looking at. If you're looking at income, then the answer is yes, but trade could have some adverse consequences as well. All right, so that's all I have. Thanks.